Now, what we generally have is something of a debate around what constitutes good academic writing at degree level or indeed at master's level. And so what we're going to do in this series of presentations is to look at a series of examples of writing that attempts to be master's level and succeeds to varying degrees. So I'm afraid there's lots of text in this, and I'm going to read out text and then analyse each example. And that's unavoidable really. If we want to look at text and analyse it, we need to actually do some reading out, I guess. So forgive me if I read from the screen. So the first example, Sunderland 2010, Boston 2002, Olin and Smith 2005, and numerous instructive texts on the teaching of biology all assert that a good approach is to use metaphor for the teaching of complex concepts in this subject. My own practice is greatly influenced by these ideas and by my experience of using them in the classroom. The literature also recommends the use of 3D models, Gaston 2006, Friedman 2010, Burton 2001, ICT, Ellis 1991, Leominster 1997, Problem-Based Learning, Barrow et al. 2009, Wickwood and Fustian 2006, and Role Play, Burntwood 2005, Justicer 2002, all of which represent a considerable body of work about the teaching of this subject, with advice for those tasked with delivering it. Indeed, this paper is founded not only upon personal experience, but is also a recognition of the aforementioned scholarly contributions that have informed my approaches and that I offer as the foundation around which this paper is to be built. So what's this student attempting to do? Well, they're definitely in their zone of proximal development. They're trying to push towards something that's beyond where they are now. And that, of course, is the point of master's level work. That's exactly what we want them to do. And they're bound to feel uncertain, but the trick is to not let that show in the text. That's the trick, and it does show in this text. But nonetheless, this is fairly typical middling master's level work that you come across. And it seems to me to indicate somebody who's attempting something really difficult. They're writing in an imagined register what they think academic writing should look like. So they've looked perhaps at some other authors, authors who say authors X, Y, Z, A, B and C say blah blah blah, and they think that they need to do the same. So they pile author on author, but without actually seeing that when this is done well, it's somebody elaborating on the same idea, not bringing in lots of new ones. And this is what's happening here, lots and lots of ideas piled one on top of the other. What they're trying to do, of course, is to locate their practice in a field, but they're trying to do it in a single paragraph. So they're trying to say that there are all these things that position my work, and they've jammed them all in. What we can see is multiple ideas in a paragraph building up. So instead of using a paragraph to talk about a single idea, what we've got is a huge number of texts all jammed in together. And this is really common in people striving to work at master's level. And if you find your students writing sentences with multiple ideas like this, the first thing to do is to advise them to look for the key idea that they want to talk about and that is relevant to their choice of topic. What is it that they're trying to get across, and then encourage them to focus in on that idea and then to try to break it down. As it is, it's fairly impenetrable actually what key idea they want to get across, so perhaps it's contained in that initial reference to the use of metaphor. But it's probably this paragraph is probably meat for 3 or 4 different papers, and what they need to do is to lose a lot of that content and to pick out just the key idea that's relevant to their choice of topic. So this is very bad academic writing, and it's the kind of writing that gives academic literature a bad name. There are too many ideas, particularly too much literature, and we've got no idea by the end of the paragraph what it's about. And the person themselves come last. They talk about personal experience, but we haven't got any of that in here, have we? We don't understand what that means. It hasn't been connected with any of the rest of it. So the writer is kind of standing back, or perhaps even drowning or lost in a maze. So this is what being lost in the text looks like. And good advice for students who are like this is around what a paragraph is for. It's got to be an idea, single idea, introduced clearly, developed coherently, and concluded cogently. And that's good advice for anybody where you find this sort of writing. Okay, the next example here then. According to this model, the teaching of construction needs to be cognitively as well as kinesthetically engaging when students are occupying and performing their role on work placement. Kay et al. 2008. This multifaceted model of engagement is acknowledged by Bristow 2009, Rostov 2006, and Salinger 2005. Taylor et al. 2006, however, offer a simpler model, stating that an enthusiasm for the vocation is a mental state that is seen to encompass the three dimensions of engagement offered by Catskill, 1990. Richards, 2001, page 6, defines engagement as cognitive presence, but states that it goes further and involves concentration and fascination. He states that fascination refers to thinking capacity and the preoccupation over time that one has in thinking about one's own work. According to the Association of Workplace Study, AWS 2014, page 47, engagement is defined as a positive disposition held by the employer towards the institution and its values. An engaged employer, just bear with me a moment, I've got a funny message. Okay, right, just where was I? Held by the employer towards the institutions and its values. An engaged employer is conscious of the context and collaborates with employees to optimize performance for the benefit of all. I felt drawn to this notion of the reciprocal relationship between the employer and the employee, and I felt it was relevant to me as a teacher who is, after all, a professional in their own right. Now, what we've got here is somebody who's attempting to offer a definition of engagement, and they're trying to say, I'm going to use this definition. And so what they're trying to do is use this as a sort of a prop for what happens in the rest of the paper. But there are a number of problematic things going on here. One of them is that it starts off with a very list-like offering rather than an argument. And by the time they say, I feel drawn to this notion, you're kind of thinking, well, which notion? There's at least 3 or 4 in the paragraph, so which is it? So the paragraph as a whole doesn't make sense. The definition that they want to use hasn't been established. What instead you've got is a kind of he said, she said, they said, as opposed to a clear definition of engagement that's been arrived at in a clearly argued way. So it looks like somebody who's done lots of reading. They've got all their ducks lined up that they're going to use to support their argument, but they haven't actually properly constructed any kind of argument. They've kind of got their notes together but haven't actually gone the next step to put them into an argument or to put them to use in their paper. The other key problem is the language around this, the closing of the paragraph. I felt drawn to this notion. Now, this is really unusual in a scholarly argument to say I felt drawn to something, because you're not really in an argument meant to be talking about whether you like or dislike anything, whether you're drawn to something or repelled by something. Unless perhaps if you were critiquing a piece of art, but then even then you'd be more likely to say this image is repulsive because, rather than I am repulsed by this image. So I feel drawn is more the kind of thing that you might do in a blog or a letter to a friend. It's not the kind of work that the scholarly eye should do. The scholarly eye should generally argue, discover, explore, investigate. So you could say, I argue that, I assert that, I suggest that, I propose that. For the purposes of this study, I will use. But they're the sort of kind of things that scholarly activity tries to do. So there's not simply a problem with the way the literature is engaged with, there's also a problem with the way that the I is situated in the text. And this would be appropriate only in a, this sort of I felt drawn to would perhaps be appropriate in a philosophical or a religious text, or when you're justifying your values or ethics towards research. Unless you're doing that, we don't generally say that we feel or believe. If we were stating our methodological commitments or our axiomatic beliefs that underpin our research, we might say I feel or I believe, but generally we don't write about our feelings or beliefs. So the he said, she said in a list is by far the most common problem in master's level writing, and you can end up with pages and pages until you, as the marker of the work, just want to throw yourself out of the window. It's really, really tiresome to read. And what's needed instead is the principle of using the literatures, not having the literatures use you. So this is you establishing what in the literature is important, relevant, problematic, in order to locate your stance to your work. And so the advice here to the student that would be the most valuable, I think, is to try to get them to come to a clear definition, perhaps informed by some of these writers, and then to use that to say how that definition is used in or informs the teaching of their subject. And that's the key thing. The key work that needs to be done by this paper is, yes, be cognizant of the specialist literature in the field, but make sure that you stick to one idea within a paragraph, that you clearly state your argument within the paragraph, and that you endeavour always to use the literature and say how it relates to your actual practice in the teaching of your subject. Right, the third example. Chartwell, 2013, believes that teachers and students have been betrayed by both policymakers and senior managers by the relentless changes and endless schemes which are not supported by convincing concepts or by data. Miles, 2013, suggests that reform after reform that is intended to boost competition between providers and bring economic gains in fact makes students victims of relentless assessment, not learning. In addition, it generates a situation in which teachers are battered into acquiescence because of the confused and confusing landscape of constantly shifting policy initiatives. As early as 1995, Yearwood argued for a move away from formal and traditional exams and towards the vocational. Current policy seems to be the reverse. Boston et al. 2012 suggests that over the last 15 years there has been a flood of schemes and policy changes to improve standards in education. However, they argue that the situation on the ground within schools and colleges is an ongoing battle with the demands of these schemes and initiatives, and with figuring out the literature that accompanies them. Mostyn, 2014, in his book Comprehending the College Curriculum, draws attention to the way that a constantly shifting curriculum results in conflicts for colleges and for teachers. Furthermore, he investigates the notion that reforms aren't based on reliable educational principles, but on an ideological belief in the power of the market. Well, there's one key problem with this text, which I'm sure many of you will already have picked out, which is that it's not at all about the teaching of the subject, and it's not even really clear what the subject might be. But beyond that, if we were looking at it as a piece of master's level work, there are some good things about it. So it is more evaluative than the two examples that we've looked at previously. So there's this notion at the start of the second paragraph there, as early as 1995, and we can hear a kind of evaluative voice creeping in there, somebody discussing the field and trying to position texts within a kind of sweep, a historical sweep of what's happened. And we've also got a strong evaluative comment in this statement. Current policy seems to be the reverse, so that's second sentence in the second paragraph. But beyond that, still, it does still have that kind of list-like quality that we noticed, particularly in the first example that we looked at. So although there are more evaluative statements in it, there's a lot of repeating what other people say. So this is a kind of person who is leaning towards becoming able to be evaluative of the literature and being able to have some kind of discussion about the nature of the field. But we're still stuck with lots of sentences that begin with the name of an author. So we've got Chartwell, Miles, Boston et al., Yearwood, Mostyn. So it's still largely based around describing what other people say, as opposed to actually being about the topic of the paper and the writer's interpretation and application of the ideas, rather than about the ideas themselves. So there is more evaluation in it, but it does keep lapsing into, I'm just going to tell you what they said. So in the last sentence there, we've got, furthermore, he investigates the notion that, and you're left thinking, well, what do you think about that? How does that affect the way you teach your subject? How does it relate to the teaching of your subject? So it's kind of an in-between step, someone who is attempting to move away. They know they need to do more than just list, but they've still got a bit of a list-like quality, and they're still not using the literature in any kind of practical sense, relating it to the teaching of their subject, or even making clear their own position in relation to that literature. Okay, moving on. Nice short example here, the fourth example. I ought to say, actually, don't try to look up any of these references. None of them are real. All of these examples are made up, and even the references are made up. So they're just illustrative, fictional examples. Okay, let's look at this one. The literature around beauty therapy as emotional labour is contested and disputed. Goodson and Westerman propose how emotional labour has been defined and altered over time and for different contexts, and the discourse of emotional labour, and therefore emotion, is thus context-driven, dependent on beliefs and value-laden. Essex et al., 2007, page 78. Lister similarly argues that beauty therapists who say they are involved in emotional labour are not using a shared definition of it, because it is defined in lots of varying ways according to the cultural, economic and social situation. 2013, page 35. So it doesn't quite scan correctly, and sometimes this happens in people trying to write at master's level. They don't properly finish a quote, they don't string the sentence together correctly in a grammatical way, and so the first thing that I would do in feeding back on work like that is to try to figure out the grammar for them and help them with the structure of it so that it reads and makes sense. But then there's a bigger problem with it if we kind of look beyond the grammatical problems. And it's really clear in this paragraph that we've got someone who does recognise there's a debate, but again, they haven't taken a position. They've done a lot of the work of showing where there are some differences in the debate. Except if we read it, what we get is an assertion that the literature is contested and disputed. But the problem with it is that isn't then borne out by the rest of the paragraph, because what you've got instead is a group of writers all kind of saying broadly the same or very similar things. So the topic sentence doesn't gel with, isn't borne out by the rest of the paragraph. So this points to the importance of, if you're going to introduce a paragraph with a topic sentence that talks about contestation and dispute, well, that's what you need to show in the rest of the paragraph. And it's surprising how often, if you look for this, you'll find that as a paragraph opens with a particular statement and then the rest of the paragraph doesn't support that statement in any way. Also, we've got a no conclusion situation here. Each paragraph needs really to have a conclusion that draws the idea together. And there is no evaluative statement or reference to where the person themselves stands or how they're using those ideas to inform the teaching of their subject. So at the level of the paragraph, we've got someone who is wanting to discuss the field, wanting to locate their work, but hasn't done it at all or achieved that at all in the writing. The writing instead is still back into these are my notes. So it's suggesting to you that there are lots of stages, I think, in producing a good paper, and there are all the stages of working out what's there in the literature, working out what's been said, organising it into some kind of sequence, but the trainee has to keep working on it right down to the level of the paragraph, so that it's the trainee in charge of the discussion actually using the literature rather than regurgitating it. So in that move from the set of notes or building blocks that they've got into something that they write and present, there's a key final move to make, which is, where do I stand in relation to all of this and how am I going to use it? And lots of people, and in fact I think the majority of people struggling to write at master's level don't actually take that final step. They often have a logic to the structure. They'll sometimes make some evaluative points about what they've read, but in between what you get are lists of what they've read strung together but not used in any way. They've got to argue for something, and that's really what master's level work must do. Okay, final example. The importance of attaining mastery of specialised language through social interaction, with learners actively engaged in constructing their own internal representations of an external reality, has a significant pedigree in the history of learning theory. For Vygotsky, the means by which these internal representations are constructed are always, in the first instance, social. Every function in the child's cultural development appears twice, first on the social level and later on the individual level, first between people and then inside the child. Vygotsky, 1978, page 57. Inspired by these ideas, the game-based approach employed here is dialogic, providing scope for interactions that are more tolerant of misconceptions than a formal didactic atmosphere. Frequent, informal, low-stakes opportunities to use specialized language are afforded within the game, so that the social interaction that Vygotsky conceives of as vital at the outset of the learning process is more successfully negotiated. This is significant given students' insecurities around academic language that frequently arise out of the class-based and entrenched attitudes to professional identity outlined earlier in this paper. So this is, I hope, much better, because what you've got is the use of Vygotsky, the repetition of some of Vygotsky's ideas, but then a clear explanation of how those ideas are relevant to and exploited or used in the design of a pedagogic approach. And so it's not just repeating what's said in the literature, hopefully it's also applying and using it, and that's a significant shift, that half of this paragraph is actually about the use of the ideas. Where it might be critiqued, perhaps, is that this isn't subject specific in any way. It's not clear what the subject specificity of it is. But having said that, not every paragraph within a paper has to relate to the teaching of the subject. If the paragraphs around it give context to and explain the subject-specific nature of this game-based approach, then that's absolutely fine. What it does illustrate, I hope, really clearly is writing at master's level. So it's informed by the literature. It doesn't pull in too many ideas. It's a single idea that we learn through interaction, and then it's played out or applied to a game-based approach that gets people talking to each other so that they start to develop the language that they need in order to understand a new set of ideas. So literature applied and not overstated, not too many ideas in one example. So that's the kind of writing that you need to try to get your learners to move towards. It's an incredibly difficult task to get them writing at master's level, and it's a constant battle, and it's a really, really difficult thing for them to do. It's a difficult thing for you to get them to move towards, particularly when you're only working with them online. But nonetheless, I hope these 6 examples that we've looked at here will give you some prompts and some new ways to look at and respond to the different kinds of examples that you see in students' work.